my interest into obedience to authority from a psychological and neuroscience perspective is really driven by these historical examples. Because of course we have the Nuremberg trials as well. ICE is a modern example, but we also have reports from former genocide perpetrators in Rwanda or in Cambodia. I remember that there was also when the Russian invasion of Ukraine started, there was Russian soldiers who hit a civilian in the back without any reason and mentioned during his trial that he was just following orders. And that's a bit, I mean, when you work on this topic, you hear this argument all the time in various cultures, different historical events. And so that makes me wonder why so many human beings use this as a justification. And it appears to be cross-cultural in a sense.
Genocide is a new word combining the Greek word genos meaning race or group, with the root of the Latin sidere meaning to kill.
Became interested in genocide because it happened so many times.
Power is all against one. Violence is the opposite. The extreme is one against all.
This is Not to Forgive, but to Understand, a podcast series discussing genocide studies with experts and those connected to its critical questions. I am Luis Gonzalez Aponte, co-host with Sabah Carrim.
And what we're about is really to try to understand why evil happens, why there are perpetrations in genocidal scenarios and scenarios of mass atrocity. Not to forgive, but to understand.
Forgive, but to understand.
Not to forgive, but to understand.
Emilie Caspar is an associate professor at Ghent University and leader of the Moral and Social Brain Lab. Her book, Just Following Orders, Atrocities and the Brain Science of Obedience, and her broader research examine how obedience to authority can alter a person's sense of responsibility when ordered to harm others. This conversation considers what neuroscience can tell us about perpetrator and rescuer behavior in context of mass violence.
We're very happy to have you here today, Emilie. We've been wanting to speak to you for a very long time, especially in view of my specific research, where I intend to delve into the legal defenses that are raised by future perpetrators of genocide. I say future just because it hasn't happened yet. We only know about the case of Dominic Ongwen, where the neuroscience evidence was raised in his case, and we've had discussions previously on the podcast about it with several experts in the field. First of all, my question to you is, in view of your expertise, why neuroscience in the field of genocide studies?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question, because I feel that sometimes I'm a bit isolated as an expert in that field, and honestly, that was not my initial goal to end to end doing neuroscience of genocide. But for me, genocide is a very complex social phenomenon because there are different stages that precede genocide. I mean, you have a categorization of a specific part of the population, you have prejudice towards them, you have hostility, you have dehumanization. These are big steps that you can recognize among many of the genocides that have occurred and that are probably occurring at the moment. And all these social influences, you can find traces of how they influence behaviors by studying the brain. So I think in this regard, and that's the same for obedience to authority, which is also one of the big steps, in this regard, neuroscience can bring additional information regarding how these social influences can turn someone into committing a crime of genocide and actively participating, for instance.
Thank you. So you have written a book, which I've read, and I really enjoy, called Just Following Orders. And in that, you basically focused on the idea that, or rather the fact that many people, especially mid-level and lower level perpetrators, tend to raise the defense that they were just following orders. In fact, we know, of course, of the notorious Adolf Eichmann, who brought that up as a defense in his trial in 1961 in Israel. We also know about even, I don't know if we should say day-to-day incidents of ICE in America, using that as a reason to justify what they are doing to people around them, to civilians. I think in the case of the Turkish girl the Turkish student from Tufts who was arrested, this is what she reported later that the ICE agent said to her. So very often it's easy to blame a superior to say that, you know, it is their fault, it is their orders that we are following. Take us into the psychology and the neuroscience of following orders, please.
Yes. So indeed, my interest into obedience to authority from a psychological and neuroscience perspective is really driven by these historical examples. Because of course we have the Nuremberg trials as well. ICE is a modern example, but we also have reports from former genocide perpetrators in Rwanda or in Cambodia. I remember that there was also when the Russian invasion of Ukraine started, there was Russian soldiers who hit a civilian in the back without any reason and mentioned during his trial that he was just following orders. And that's a bit, I mean, when you work on this topic, you hear this argument all the time in various cultures, different historical events. And so that makes me wonder why so many human beings use this as a justification. And it appears to be cross-cultural in a sense. And when you look at experimental research, notably the famous work of Stanley Milgram, I mean, his paradigm was, ethically problematic for various reasons, but his results were very striking because they showed that even for the sake of a study, a majority of people could just accept to follow orders to potentially kill another human being. Well, they're just random citizens, and he never found any effects of education or gender or such kinds of difference. So it looks like the problematic of obedience is very real from historical events, but we can also capture it experimentally. And for instance, the studies of Milgram, they were pretty informative to show that, yes, random people can comply to harmful orders. But I was missing, like, how is it possible? Why the behavior of people is going to change that much just because they follow the orders of an authority? And of course, I do not mean that a genocide, which is an extreme event, is happening only because of following orders. As I've mentioned, there are many different stages that you can find across history. But still, it seems that obedience to authority has such an impact on people that it can change something inside them. And I think for that, neuroscience is a very useful tool because since we're targeting or like something very difficult to assess at the psychological level, because when you have to do moral or immoral behaviors, if you just rely on interviews or for instance, explicit methods or measurements, there is a high chance that it's going to be biased. For instance, at a trial, if people say, oh, I don't feel responsible because I'm just following orders, perhaps it's the case, but perhaps they also diminish on purpose their own responsibility just to avoid punishment, for instance. And so the advantage of neuroscience is that we can really see how the brain responds when people follow orders compared to, for instance, when they are acting freely. And that is informative to explain how their behaviors can change.
Right. And so my question now is, and this is very, very interesting because in court for the longest time, we have used the superior orders defense. That's how we know it in legal terms. Now, the comparable explanation of that defense in psychology is what we know as obedience to authority, or what Milgram what Milgram discussed as the obedience paradigm. And then we also now, you come in with the neuroscientific perspective on all of this. My question is, if you're in a court setting, how does a lawyer manage to bring up all of these different explanations? Now, I will say this just as a lawyer myself, it's rather easy to bring up a legal defense. Again, maybe I'm biased, but it's rather easy to bring it up in a court setting. It's rather easy to even bring up psychological explanations in a court setting because it's pretty understandable by everyone. But how do you face the challenge of bringing up neuroscientific explanations in court when from the get-go, it is intimidating with all of its complicated jargon?
Yeah, that I totally understand. And it's actually interesting that you asked this question because I'm also teaching this to law and criminology students during their first year in Belgium. And the first thing I say is that pay attention to what you use, because it's not because a study, for instance, what I observe at the neuroscientific level or in the brain are group results. So it doesn't mean that because one person would have, for instance, a reduced empathy by following orders, that this person is necessarily going to be able to have an excuse for what happened. The directionality of the effect is sometimes difficult. And the thing is that it's true that for neuroscience, interpreting the results most of the time involve knowing what we are actually assessing with neuroscience equipment, for instance. We cannot say, if we see a study, the results of a study that say, oh, that brain regions is reduced or impacted in that situation, that was shown with EEG. That's not possible, because EEG, for instance, is not a tool that allows to have such spatial contrast, for instance. And so that's one difficulty. And I think for that, requiring or mandating experts to interpret, such as a court is going to mandate a psychiatrist as an expert, I think perhaps it's also interesting to bring neuroscientists, if this happens, as experts, because they will help to balance a bit the findings and the interpretations of the finding. And at the same time, what is difficult is that with neuroscience methods nowadays, we can see lots of things in the brain, but we cannot predict everything. We still are limited by the technology, even if it's already quite good. There are huge progresses can be made. And so I always warn my student that it's not because a study found something in neuroscience that you can extrapolate it to all situations. And for instance, the question of obedience to authority is a question regarding its use in courts and its neuroscience results. I'm always wondering if it's a good thing or a bad thing, because there are different perspectives. On the one hand, you have obedience to authority when people receive instructions and they choose to obey. And then you have more coercive contexts where there is a direct threat, like if you don't obey, we're going to kill your family. So I think these are already two different decisions, because now that I'm studying rescuers during genocides, for instance, these are people who also received orders, and yet they choose the totally opposite direction and chose to risk their life to save others. So it's difficult, because even if we see that obedience to authority can have a strong impact at the brain level, that doesn't mean that people cannot choose another behavior. Depends on the context, of course. And I think it should be like a case that is evaluated on its own each time. And the additional problem of all this, and that's specifically true for war crimes or genocides, is that we can say that obedience blurs morality in a way, because people are able to commit atrocities. But the problem is that because all the stages that happened before, such as dehumanization, people that are actively participating, they don't see anymore the fact that it's immoral or illegal. For them, they're convinced that it's the right thing to do. And I guess in that reason, in that purpose, the question of obeying orders becomes like a gift for them, because intrinsically they are led to believe that they want to exterminate a part of the population. In addition, they don't have to feel that responsible because someone is giving them orders. That's a perfect situation for them, and that's very dangerous.
So what happens then when a perpetrator or the lawyer of a perpetrator, the defense counsel, raises a defense based on neuroscience in the case of obedience to authority? What is the result you hope that will be achieved in the process? Because obviously here, we know what happened to Hannah Arendt when she tried to provide an explanation for Eichmann. She was condemned because many people failed to understand that she wasn't trying to find an excuse for him. She was just trying to basically dig into how people or why people do what they do in the context of a genocide. So let's get down to this, because we're discussing a very important perpetrator defense here, which is the defense of obedience to authority. And people may wrongly believe that we are trying to find a defense to allow the perpetrator to go scot-free. That's not what we're trying to achieve, right?
No, not at all. Really not at all. For me, the main goal actually is not even to consider this in court. for me, the main goal is to raise awareness. So, for instance, there is this famous effect in psychology, the bystander effect, where people, if they're in groups, are less likely to help someone in need. And it has been shown that when you're aware of this mechanism, people are more likely to then help, even if they are in a group. And so it's a bit, my aim here first was not really to consider any court examples. It was really to say, if we raise awareness, like we explain to people, look, if you receive an order, this is what is happening in your brain, perhaps, then if people are more aware, they are more likely to perhaps not get easily influenced by authority figures or by others. I think that, when you realize this, that's a first step, I would say, in the comprehension. And by showing that other people chose other behaviors, such as rescuers, who are a living example of this alternative choice, I think this shows even more that you have other options possible. And so for me in courts, I don't think it's necessarily good to deny responsibility just because of following orders. I mean, we are not in cases of psychiatric patients who cannot really consider the intention or the consequence and responsibility of their action. We're in the case of healthy adults who can measure what they're doing.
Right.
The question of coercion for me is different because, of course, if your family and you have proof that your family is threatened or your own life, that can be a bit different. But I don't think that this justification should be used as a real defense because we can see that people have the choice.
Yeah.
And in addition, I think it shows that those giving orders should be judged equally.
So here what comes to mind, and this may sound like a digression, but there's a very interesting article I read in the New York Times that discussed whether it's good that we have become aware about, for instance, being on the spectrum or suffering from ADHD and all of these rather new diagnoses, but because the original thinking was, let's try to increase awareness and maybe we can combat the social problems we have as a result of these diagnoses. The answer, or rather the explanation given in that interview, in that article I read, was that having the awareness of these conditions doesn't necessarily help us in overcoming them in social situations. So what I'm saying is, what I'm thinking about is, obviously your project is very laudable, but it comes with the challenge of the people who ought to be aware of these effects on them. In the end, there will be very few in the lot. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think you're right, because in addition, I mean, and that's always the case in academic research, we can have an impact among our peers because they will understand our scientific publications or so else. But having an impact more broadly on the general public is sometimes more difficult. And sometimes, I explain that to people and they don't even realize that they're influenced themselves for other effects. So raising awareness is difficult, but there is something I like to do now when I'm giving talks, and most of the time I have feedbacks of people saying them that really puzzled them and made them think. I ask them to answer anonymously to an online question where I ask them, like, imagine you are in a fictional society where a group of the population is blamed for economic and political insecurity. Do you think you would act as a perpetrator or as a rescuer risking their life to save them? And I have done that test in many different contexts. And interestingly, the huge majority, when I say the huge, is always between 80 and 99%, will report, oh, I will act as rescuers. So naturally, people think to believe that they will never fall prey to hateful propaganda and, that they will show the moral good. But when then I show them the real statistics, like in the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda or during the Holocaust, we can see that rescuers are less than 1% of the whole population, and that many more people accept to participate actively in those processes. So it's always good to help you think, perhaps I'm not that special, and perhaps I would be influenced myself by all this.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Absolutely. So tell us more about the technicalities of doing all of these experiments. A question I get often in interviews whenever I speak about my thesis is people who are outside the field or slightly outside this specific area of research ask, so do you mean that you will use millions of EEGs and fMRIs because you're using, neuroscience methods to do research? Can you tell us more about, how I know this is untrue, and also the alternative ways of conducting neuroscientific research?
Mhm. Yeah, so there are different ways to do it. There is the easy way and the less easy way. The easy way, which is still not that easy, is to run experiment in the context of laboratories at the university. So if we have the equipments, if you are in an institution that can afford buying those equipments, that's already a good start. And you recruit university students, they do experimental tasks, and then you analyze the results. Most of the time, you need one or two colleagues because it's not that easy to analyze, but still you manage to find something, and that's not that difficult. You recruit a sample that is considered representative of the general population because you recruit between, it can be 30 to 100 participants. In neuroscience, we can generally not have that many participants, not such as in social psychology, for instance, because of course that's very expensive, that requires lots of time. So there are limitations for this. And then, and this is what I'm trying to do, is to try to study also populations who have a more direct experience with obedience to authority. Because students at the university, yeah, of course, they represent the population, but they don't represent the diversity of the population, and they may still have a limited experience of the disastrous consequences of obedience. And for instance, I started to study those questions as well in military populations, for instance. And recently, we also did that with EEG on actual genocide perpetrators in Rwanda and rescuers to see if they differ regarding to their sensitivity to obedience to authority, but also if their brain reacts differently. That can explain that they showed different behavior in 94.
I do remember that reading about your use of EEG, the portable EEG, which is rather new and which Francis Shen is currently, has written very widely about in the last few months, I would say. Tell us about the challenges that you faced carrying that portable EEG, which I do remember you recounting in the book, but I'd love to know more. And also about something else which I deem very important. MRIs, EEG, and all of these different devices that are available to study the brain are probably more familiar to certain cultures rather than other cultures. And so one of the other impediments in the process of doing research is to figure out ways to overcome the intimidation to overcome the ways in which people who are being experimented on may react in an intimidated manner to these devices because they are not familiar with these devices. And because these devices look very scientific and AI-like, they might in fact instill a lot of fear in these people and may defeat the purposes of the experiment. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. And I would say the first difficulty was actually to get money to do those research abroad, especially in rural Rwanda or Cambodia, because doing portable EEG in such settings is really not common. Almost no neuroscientist is doing that. And as an anecdote, when I first tried to obtain funding to do this research, I was refused by scientific panels because they say, that's impossible. No one can do portable EEG in Rwanda, for instance, on these populations. Yeah. So I had to use the very late, I still had like a few €1,000, 3,000 maximum on my postdoctoral grants. And I said, okay, I'm going to spend it to go to Rwanda, do one single study to show it's feasible, come back to Belgium, publish it, and then I hope I will get additional fundings because I would have proven feasibility. And that worked, actually.
Oh,
but I would say that was that was a very difficult first step. So, but indeed, this is not common. I mean, EEG, MRI, these are technologies that are not really accessible by many populations in the world. And for instance, even if they exist, they are mostly in cities. So people in rural regions across the world, they barely access it. But even more simple technologies such as a computer is also something that you may not encounter in these environments. And so when we started those projects, there was also the question of how do we bring our equipment in the target countries, but that we use diplomatic bags, so that's okay. And then we put them in a car and we drive every day to different villages. But then it's really a matter of trust, because of course we come with all these equipments, and then we tell people we have to put that on your head to see how your brain reacts. Of course, that's scary, and many of them, they think that we can read their mind, or that we are medical doctors, or there are lots of beliefs for this. And so most of the time what you do is that we work with local NGOs working with those populations, so we can start building a trust relationship. So we meet with them, we take the time to explain, we show them, we explain that there is absolutely no danger, that it's not invasive, and so on. Some people are a bit more afraid than others. Sometimes we also do it on our own first to show them that it's really riskless. And then after some time, they actually accept it. And now actually we work with those populations since many years. And when they see us, they directly recognize the tool. And it's actually very funny for them. Most of the time, we're a huge attraction in the villages where we go because, we come with so much devices. And when we have built that trust relationship, things are, of course, getting easier. But at the same time, in neuroscience, most of the results that we obtain are based on computer tasks, where people have to press on keys to show their decisions. That's something that is pretty obvious for us, but that may not be the case for people who have no access to these kinds of technology. So first of all, we have to teach them how to press the key of a keyboard, for instance, to indicate an answer. And this is when you're not used to do field research, you're like, okay, that's obvious. We tell them, okay, press that button and that's going to be okay. But the person first needs to recognize the letter or the symbol on the keyboard. And you have to teach them, for instance, okay, but you have to press, but then you have to release. Otherwise, it doesn't work. That sounds obvious for us, but it's not at all for them. So it's always very interesting to see that. But honestly, when we work with the right NGOs, when we really take time to explain, to answer the questions, it works quite well. And I'm always amazed by their resilience regarding this.
That's very interesting. So obviously there are a lot of challenges, and I guess one of the ways to overcome this initial alienation from the EEG devices and other neuroscience, brain imagery devices, is to give them the chance to habituate themselves to all of these devices. Now, you definitely obviously need time to spend in the place before you can do these experiments. Following this, I have another question regarding something that I think all neuroscientists are faced with, and this is the idea or the problem of neurohype. Now, I remember when I was in Malaysia and I lived there for 15 years previously, I remember at one of the institutions where I was teaching, there were these so-called experts who came in from America, and they claimed that they were working for the military and they had all up-to-date equipment at their disposal. And they wanted to show us or do a demonstration of this device that you could attach to your brain, and which would allow them to identify the exact disease that you may have in the future. And they would then provide the right kind of sound wave to reverse this process. So this is just one of the many examples of how neurohype takes place. Neurohype is exploited. Tell us more about neurohype, and tell us more about how you have to be careful with it within your profession and within your research study.
Yeah, I think it's good that you point that out, because I honestly, I feel as a person using this method and as a neuroscientist, that I have to be very careful regarding what I say and how I use this argument as an authority argument, actually. Because we can see more and more that people say, oh, I'm a neuroscientist, listen to me, I can do very amazing things and check your brain. But that's a discipline as many other disciplines. And I think we have to be humble as well, because there are also lots of limitations with neuroscience methods that we know when we are neuroscientists and that we acknowledge for in our papers. But for instance, one of my main concerns most of the time is when I have the press release following an article that I've published. Because of course, with such topics, it's quite frequent. And then I can have very weird things like, oh, a scientist proved, I had that once, prove how the terrorist attacks in Brussels happened. Never, not at all. I never even mentioned that into a single paper. But just because they saw obedience to authority and EEG, that was enough for the media to report it as an argument that I didn't agree for. And so it really bothers me a lot because we try to do good science. I mean, most of us try to do good science and to really be humble regarding limitations of what we observe as well. And most of the time, because of this hype, people use neuroscience methods as if it was the Graal or I don't know. And so a thing that I'm trying to do myself a lot at the moment is when I publish a new paper and I know I can have media coverage over it, I write the press release version myself. That I diffuse. Well, people use it or not, that's another question. But I try to control to make sure that what is written in the press release and what's going to be shared with the media reflects accurately without overselling what is observed. So, but I think it's also a matter of responsibility and being aware that it's not because you're a neuroscientist and you do something complicated or seen as complicated that you can use that argument.
So tell us about, you've written this book called, obviously, Just Following Orders, which we discussed earlier. And you've written several papers as well on neuroscience. What's next is my question to you.
Next is another book, actually. I may take a bit more time than the first one, because the first one I had time, it was during COVID period. Now I'm a bit more busier. But so the thing is that when I wrote that book for a general audience, I realized that it didn't help my natural pessimism towards humanity. Like, hearing about atrocities all the time, hearing those justifications, writing about them myself, it's not super easy at the emotional level to manage all this suffering, to hear about that all the time. And now that's also perhaps because I wanted to have a more positive note in my life regarding the research I'm conducting. I decided I wanted to focus more on rescuers, those very few individuals, as we mentioned, who risk their life to save others. And I end the final chapter of the first book on those rescuers. So the question of the rescuer is something I've already approached in the final chapter of my book because I wanted to finish on a positive note. But there is not that much research on them. There research on personality traits or social factors, but from a neuroscience perspective, no one has done this before. And now I'm really trying to focus more on those who are resisting, those who really showed that another choice is possible. And I want to write a book on them, actually, to share the stories I have from these rescuers and also to explain with psychology and neuroscience how they made these different decisions, what distinguished them from others. Right. Because I think that if we understand them better, their mechanism, then it's where we can perhaps start to consider interventions that would be perhaps successful, hopefully.
One of the thoughts that bugged me when I started this research was the fact that, as you go on in time, as we mentioned earlier, you have these different epistemologies, these different disciplines that come together and provide you with an alternative explanation to something. Now, in genocide studies, we keep seeing that. Any kind of phenomenon, for instance, just in understanding why perpetrators do what they do, we have theories from a variety of experts from a variety of fields. Alex Mullers, Professor Alex Mullers is one of the many who, for instance, compiled all the different theories to explain why people do what they do. in genocidal scenarios. So my question is, and this is a bit daunting and it's a bit philosophical here, but if psychology has for the longest time provided explanations for why people do what they do, and now we have neuroscience, have you thought about what's next, or how we should now, just as critical reviewers of the field, critical inquirers of the field, how should we look upon neuroscience now providing us with these explanations?
Yeah, that's actually a great question, because I'm also wondering this, since I'm entering that field as well with neuroscience, like how I'm balancing with what is already existing and how I can be integrated into this. And one thing we're trying to do more and more is that, even if the background is neuroscience, is to use a multi-method approach. For instance, if I'm going to study obedience and disobedience among perpetrators and rescuers, I'm going to do it with EEG. I'm also going to do it with behavioral measurements, and I'm also going to do it through questionnaires and self-reports. And so I think at the moment, in terms of obvious next step, is to ensure that more people can use this multi-method approach. Because if you measure the same thing, or what is supposed to be the same thing, at the same time with the same experimenter and the same participants, it's easier to create bridges between these different levels of data and how they can overlap or not. Because the additional problem that I see in the field is that these are different methods leading to different theories, but also on different participants and collected by different experimenters. So it adds an extra layout or extra layouts of variability inside the fact that you can or not combine things. And if you use this multi-method approach on the same participants collected at the same time, it's easier to see where they start overlap or not. And sometimes we observe dissociations between what participants show at the behavioral level, what you observe in the brain. And so that helps to regulate a bit the theories, because I would never dare to say that a theory is only proven when you have one types of data proving it. I think it's really a combination of disciplines and methods that can only show that a phenomenon perhaps is worth being transformed into a theory.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm going to now just go back to what I'm fixated with at the moment because of my research. I want to go back to the court setting. And I want you to tell us a little bit more about something you discussed earlier, which is about the fact that, you know, neuroscientific findings are still verdant, they're nascent. We're still exploring a lot of things. We don't have a lot of firm conclusions about things, which is why there is a tendency to reach hard and fast conclusions, which is incorrect in the field of neuroscience, and which is what is being exploited by journalists and by other people who want to use headlines that are shocking and that would attract, you know, readers to their columns. I want to talk about how neuroscience evidence is approached in courts in the specific context of how it is usually only corroborative. So it only comes in to supplement already existing evidence. And I think we need to talk about this because people may jump to the assumption, to the easy assumption and the wrong assumption, that you can use neuroscience evidence in court as is in its entirety. Is just about a defendant, for instance, raising the fact that here is neuroscience evidence. I was probably very depressed during this period of my life, and I did things that I am very regretful about. So tell us more about how the findings are really new. How do you face this as a challenge when you're doing research? And how we should always remember that neuroscience is still very closely married to behavioral psychology, social psychology, and doesn't really stand alone.
Yeah, no, clearly. I think it's a real danger to just use findings in neuroscience to infer something. Because as I was saying, in neuroscience, when we see something, especially in research, it's always group results. But that doesn't mean that we can infer the opposite, that necessarily someone with this process being altered is going to act in the same way. And that's a bit the same, I'm extrapolating here, but when you see the use of in courts of defenses such as a very bad childhood, and indeed for some instances, this is the reason why the person acts the way they did. But there are also many people with similar childhood who do not turn into criminality or towards criminality. So I think that neuroscience in this regards can help understand, but I would be very cautious at the moment to infer anything based on this. But there are also interesting cases which I think deserves to be mentioned. And I remember, I don't have the name of that case specifically. I think it was in the US, where it was a guy who, I don't know, he was 40 or 50, and he started developing inappropriate behaviors towards children. And two neurologists looked at the brain and found a specific tumor. They removed it, and these inappropriate behaviors disappeared. And when they came back, they did an MRI again, and they found that the tumor was back. And so they removed it again. And I think this one is very strong to show that, yes, the brain is indeed the central organ to influence our behaviors. I mean, that's the brain and the billions of neurons that we have that are transforming our intention into a behavior. And of course, if the brain has an issue regarding how to process information, that's going to be reflected into behaviors. But that doesn't mean that anyone with these kinds of tumor is going to act in the same way, or that doesn't mean that someone acts like this just because there might be a problem in his brain that makes that it's not responsible. So there are good arguments to show that indeed neuroscience can explain different behaviors, but I would indeed really be careful and just use this as an additional thing, perhaps. And yet it also depends on how studies are conducted, because you can find a paper showing a link between a specific brain activation and a behavior, but if on the side no other authors observed that, or it has not been replicated, that's also risky. And so that's why I think that when bringing neuroscience experts into court, I mean, bringing these experts would be something important to really learn to balance the findings, to show if did meta-analysis confirm these effects, did other teams replicated those results, and so on. These are very important questions.
On one hand, we've spoken a lot about how people are very open to neuroscience evidence, or they can misuse it, or because of the hype around neuroscience as a field, people tend to, of course, come up with reductive conclusions about a lot of its findings. What about the other side of the story, which is resistance to neuroscience evidence? Let's go back to that case you just mentioned of that school teacher. It was a middle school teacher. He actually was not only guilty of sexually assaulting his own students, but also his own stepdaughter, if I remember the facts correctly. But when I recount this case to my students, and if I don't go into many details, they tend to think, oh, how could that be possible? This is just somebody who's coming up with any excuse he can to get away, to escape any kind of persecution by the law. So it's only when you go into details, you show them the process of how the defendant, in this case, the sexual assault perpetrator, how his behavior changed to the drawings that he did before, after, during, and how, when you get into the details of the brain tumor that he suffered from and you show them these brain images, it's only then that they start to believe. So there is a lot of resistance to findings in neuroscience as well. And tell us how you encountered that, and tell us how you overcame that as well.
Yeah, actually, this is not a situation I've encountered a lot. I most of the time have the opposite effects, like the hype and, oh, that's proving everything. And that's more my problem. I barely met, even during classes or during conferences for general public, I barely met these arguments. But I think it's also because people are sensitive to how you try to explain things. If you just say, oh, this is like this because this is what we showed, that's not very scientific. And people who have the right to say, it's not explained, so that the link is perhaps a bit, not clear or not reliable. If you really try to have the honest perspective and say, okay, this is what we have found, this is what could explain a causal link, but perhaps this is a confound factor as well. I think it helps people to really understand what are the actual results. And I think another interesting example is the Phineas Gage with the metallic bar in the prefrontal cortex and his behavior changing from being very social, polite, and respectful of rules, and he totally changed into someone rather antisocial. And yeah, in a way, we know that behaviors are caused by the brain. You can just study how brain regions are interconnected. They send signals to the motor cortex, sending signals to the spinal cords that is responsible for movements and actions or what we say. So the fact that behaviors are related to the brain is relatively easy to understand. But then indeed, the how we show causality or not is important. And that may also depend on the experimental method that we chose. For instance, in that case, when I present it to my students, I say, this is very interesting because the fact that it's removed, then his misbehaviors are changing, it's back, it changes again. That's very strong, but that's still only a case study. And then I warn them about the difference between a case study and a group study. And I also try to warn them about correlational results and more causal results. For instance, when you interfere with neuromodulation techniques, and most of the time when we make a conclusion that starts to be very strong is when we have more this causal influence on large cohorts with methods that can bring this notion of causality. But if you're not an expert in statistics and you see a result, you may misinterpret it.
Building on communicating this to students and the general public, I want to go to your book again and the epilogue that you included. You quote Jean-Jacques Goldman's song, Born in 17 in Leidenstadt.
Yeah.
To use this to illustrate the unsettling question of what we might have done under Nazi Germany. It's a reflection on how our own, let's say, susceptibility. You go on to stress the importance of understanding perpetrators without excusing them, writing that, quote, understanding is the key to preventing, which speaks directly to the heart of this podcast's name, not to forgive, but to understand, of course, coming from Hannah Arendt. What does this idea of understanding as prevention mean in practical terms for how we educate future generations about moral responsibility, and also to your work pertaining to rescuers? Can we have a society of rescuers?
Yeah, that's a question I would love to have the answer to. But I think it's very crucial, as you mentioned, not to forgive, but understand. And when we have to talk about topics as severe as genocide, it's very difficult sometimes to speak about what we know because sometimes people have very emotional reactions and perhaps they were victims themselves, and it's totally understandable that you may think that because we try to understand, it means that we try to provide an excuse, which is absolutely not the case. And for instance, rescuers, the fact that we are studying them at the moment, so we start to find key differences between perpetrators, bystanders, and rescuers. It's not lots, but at the moment, we have one paper where we observe that among many social factors, only the presence of role model in their early life apparently help explain why they were rescuers. But of course, it's not absolute. We also have former perpetrators who did have role models with their parents helping threaten human beings in their childhood, and yet they still acted as perpetrators. But it looks like more rescuers had these role models. And with EEG, we also observe that they have a higher response to the distress of others, of potential victims, compared to former perpetrators and bystanders. And perhaps it's linked to the fact that they had role models. So, for instance, we try to understand a bit more that empathy or having role models is or are perhaps factors that can explain differences. And so, for instance, as an intervention of what I'm trying to do now with these findings is to develop storybooks for teenagers, for instance, where I will depict real stories of ordinary people who acted as rescuers during genocides or other events, to provide with these role models, to show what they did for those who may not benefit from having this. I'm not going to say that it's going to create a full society of rescuers, but perhaps it will be sufficient to, to show that a change is possible or another behavior is possible. And those stories, they are very impactful. One of the women I have from Rwanda who acted as a rescuer, it's insane because she decided during the genocide to save children who were from the Tutsi minority around her house by providing them with food and so on. And actually, her own husband was one of the main perpetrators, was one of the leader of the perpetrators. So she was hiding those children right under the nose of her husband. And so I think these are stories, they stay with in your head after. When you see that, you see the courage of these people, you're like, I would like to be able to do the same if the situation, I want to be on the good part of history in a way. So perhaps this is the solution. And perhaps by understanding these processes, we can tell to people, look, this is how it works. And this is what these people did. So we don't have to lecture people, that never works, but just providing them with examples that are relevant based on the literature and what you observe, I think that can help. But yeah.
So should we say that, according to Milgram, I remember that one of the conclusions he drew was that usually 70% of the crowd follows, the trend, and then 30% decides to desist. And these are the people who are, who put up resistance and don't do what everybody else does. So what are your observations so far on that, on these statistics?
Yeah, I think that in Milgram studies, as it did lots of variants of his initial study, it showed that many social factors can influence obedience or resistance beyond individual behaviors. And for instance, studying rescuers, I realized that it's very difficult to make a broad conclusion. For instance, you have rescuers who acted totally on their own, and you have rescuers who acted just because someone asked for help. Otherwise, they would probably just have been bystanders. Or you have others who are acting as rescuers because they are supported by a group, like their family or their village, helping them to rescue others. At the individual level, perhaps they would not have done anything. And so it seems that the context also strongly influences someone's behavior. And what is also particularly difficult, that cannot be explained by mere theories based on personality traits, is that we have lots of examples of people sometimes acting as perpetrators and on another day acting as a rescuer. We have that in Rwanda, we have that during the Holocaust. So making generalization about the behavior of someone is very difficult, and I think it's very hard to predict who is going to act as a resistant or not. And in one situation, we may choose to act in a specific way, but in another one, we would adopt a totally different behavior. I think it's important to remember that but in the end, as I was mentioning in the beginning, when we just look at pure statistics, it's still less than 1% actively resisting these propagandas during genocide, which is very few, not even the 30% mentioned by Milgram.
Absolutely. And I think what we also see even in the current atmosphere right now, where things are very tense, and especially over here in America, just being in the field of genocide studies, the question that a lot of people outside have is, why aren't you guys talking about what's going on in the world right now? And actually, the truth is many of us are scared, and many of us are avoiding good conversation because we'd rather just actually follow not orders here, but the authority, because we are scared of repercussions, small or big, to our lives, to our safety, to our well-being. And even if we're actually witnessing the following of orders, even at this very mild level where we don't really have to get involved in questions about killing people, we are already obeying at the level of just being, for instance, scholars who are caving into the pressure out there.
Yeah, I totally relate to that because I'm also asked sometimes this, and I find myself in a balance where if I speak very honestly about what I think about some main events in the world at the moment, I'm afraid that I will not be able to access those specific countries to conduct research, which I think would help. And so there is also the balance between how to ensure that I'm not going to put on any blacklist and be able to continue doing those research because they can be informative to prevent genocide, against speaking loudly, but then for sure being on the blacklist, for instance. And it's a difficult balance at the moment to find.
Absolutely, I can imagine. And I think there are a lot of countries that, we may have mentioned during the course of this interview where the government is pretty authoritarian and would actually take definite action against any kind of researchers, especially from the West, who would be wanting to do research in their countries. I completely understand that.
Yeah, exactly. We have to be very careful, and it's very a balance between, speaking loudly or continuing having access until we can, and then speaking loudly later. It's always difficult.
This was Not to Forgive, but to Understand, with our guest, Emilie Caspar. To our listeners, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more discussions.